The rain on Ouroboros outpost was not a gift from the heavens, but a persistent curse from the atmospheric processors. It was recycled condensation, water that had journeyed through 10,000 artificial lungs and cooling manifolds before leaking from the rusted overhead grates. I had stopped finding the metaphor for my life depressing about 5 years ago. Now I just found it wet, which was reason enough to haul the last crate of synthetic plasma inside before the humidity ruined the seals. I was sealing the primary airlock when something slammed into the exterior hull. It was not the rhythmic thrum of a docking shuttle or the erratic percussion of space debris. Wind did not grunt, and vacuum did not bleed. Jackson Vane, I told myself. Just finish the lock. Go inside. Make that terrible sludge you call coffee and pretend the galaxy is not screaming. But the sound came again. A heavy, wet thud followed by a hiss of pain that my military training instantly cataloged. Someone was trying very hard to be a ghost and failing because their internal organs were currently having a disagreement with a piece of shrapnel. I sighed, adjusted my grip on the heavy magnetic wrench, and cycled the manual override. She fell forward before the door had even fully retracted. I caught a glimpse of silver hair plastered to a pale forehead and eyes the color of a dying star before she hit the deck. She caught herself on one hand, a move that required a level of core strength most humans did not possess after being shot, and looked up at me. Her gaze was not one of a victim seeking a savior. It was the look of a predator who was absolutely furious about the indignity of needing a mechanic for her ribcage. Blood, dark and shimmering with a faint bioluminescent hue, seeped through her fingers where she clutched her side. Her attire had once been expensive high-density weave, now reduced to scorched rags, but it was the ears that made my pulse skip a beat. They were long, elegantly tapered, and swept back toward her temples in a way that no genetic modification clinic on Earth could replicate. "Are you going to stare, human?" she spat, the words catching on a jagged breath. "Or are you going to prove that your species has some utility beyond breeding and bureaucracy?" I did not answer. My hands moved of their own accord, shifting from the grip of a wary scavenger to the steady, impersonal touch of a trauma surgeon. I grabbed her shoulders, steadying the tremors I knew were the heralds of shock. "Can you walk?" I asked, my voice dropping into that flat, clinical monotone that had seen me through 3 planetary sieges. "The treatment room is 20 feet. If you can make it, we can skip the part where I have to drag your royal backside across a dirty floor. If you collapse, I am charging you double for the laundry." Something flickered in those starlight eyes. It was not quite gratitude, more like a spark of recognition. A soldier recognizing a soldier, even if one of us was wearing a stained lab coat and the other was bleeding out. "I can walk," she said, though her knees buckled the moment she tried to put weight on her left leg. I kept a firm hand on her elbow the entire way, counting her heart rate by the throb in her arm. She was running hot, way above 37 degrees Celsius. Solari physiology was a nightmare of accelerated metabolism and redundant systems. By the time I got her onto the stainless steel treatment table, I was already mentally calculating the dosage of stabilizers needed for a heart that beat 300 times a minute. I reached for my heavy-duty shears and began cutting away the ruined fabric. The wounds were deep, 3 jagged lacerations that looked like they had been made by a high-frequency vibroblade. "This is going to hurt," I muttered, reaching for the quantum pulse scanner. The scanner, I mean. "The actual debridement comes later, and that is going to be a real joy for both of us." "I have survived the vacuum of the Great Rift," she gritted out, her knuckles white as she gripped the edges of the table. "Your little toys do not frighten me." "Good for you," I said, watching the scanner's display. "You have 3 deep lacerations, one roughly 3 millimeters from your primary mesenteric artery. You also have blunt force trauma suggesting you were thrown through a bulkhead, and burns on your palms that look like you tried to catch a plasma bolt with your bare hands. Either you have the worst luck in the sector, or you have some very dedicated enemies." "Both," she whispered. She watched me prepare the surgical field with the intensity of a hawk. Most patients looked away when the needles came out. She tracked every movement, assessing my efficiency, looking for a weakness. "You are not asking who I am," she noted, her voice steadying as her Solari healing began to fight the shock. I reached for the antiseptic. the kind that stung like a swarm of hornets. Would you give me an honest answer if I did? No. Then I am saving us both the oxygen, I said, and pressed the soaked gauze to the first wound. She hissed, her body tensing into a rigid line of muscle in defiance, but she did not flinch away. I worked quickly, my fingers moving with the practiced precision of a man who had performed surgeries in the back of a moving troop transport under heavy artillery fire. The nano-stitcher hummed as I passed it over the smaller nicks, the silver filaments weaving into her skin and encouraging her core to bridge the gaps. You are Solari, I said, not looking up from the stitcher. Probably highborn, given the density of your bone structure. I have read the tactical manuals. Never met one of your kind out here, though. The hegemony usually keeps its toys in the inner systems. The manuals say we are gods, she murmured, her eyes half closing as the local anesthetic finally took hold. The manuals are written by people who want to sell more guns, I countered, moving to the deepest wound near her hip. My fingers were covered in her luminescent blood, making the room look like a neon-lit crime scene. To a medic, you are just a collection of organic tubes that are currently leaking. Gods do not need nanostitches. That earned me a short, sharp laugh that ended in a wince. You are an insolent creature, Jackson Vane. I checked her nameplate on the scanner. I had seen the face on the news feeds 3 weeks ago. Commander Xylera, the spear of the hegemony, the woman who had single-handedly brokered the siege of Krell. Stay still, Commander, I said, ignoring the sudden weight of her identity. If you keep laughing, I am going to sew your spleen to your ribcage. And honestly, my coffee is already bad enough. I do not need a vengeful alien ghost haunting the break room. The silence that followed was heavy, filled only with the rhythmic hum of the atmospheric scrubbers and the occasional drip of water from a leaky pipe in the corner. I finished the primary sutures and reached for the biosynthesizer bandages. My hands did not shake. They never did when I had a job to do. It was only afterward, when the adrenaline cleared and the silence moved in, that the ghost started whispering. Do you realize, human, that I am not an ordinary person? I paused, a roll of synthetic gauze in my hand. I looked up and met those amber eyes. Up close, they were even more unsettling, filled with flecks of gold and a weariness that looked like it had been forged in the heart of a supernova. There was a challenge in her voice, a need to be acknowledged as the legend she was. I looked at her, really looked at her, and then went back to wrapping her side. I do not care if you are the Empress of the Void or a freighter rat from the scrapyards. You are currently a patient who is 3 seconds away from a massive infection if I do not finish this. That makes you ordinary enough for my clinic. She watched me with a predator's focus as I secured the final bandage. Most people react differently to me. They either kneel or they try to find a way to sell my location to the highest bidder. You just complain about your coffee and the laundry. I would be a pretty pathetic medic if I spent my time kneeling, I said, stepping back to admire the work. You are lucky. Your Solari metabolism already has the edges of the wounds knitting together. Physics is still physics, though. You push too hard, you tear the stitches. You tear the stitches, we are back to square one, and I am charging you for the extra supplies. I need to move, she said, trying to sit up. The movement was clumsy, lacking her usual grace. My enemies, they are not the type to wait for a medical discharge. The obsidian coil? I asked, walking over to the sink to wash the silver blood from my hands. She stiffened. How do you know that name? Because they are the only ones with the budget to use high-frequency vibroblades in this sector. Also, there is a bounty on your head large enough to buy this entire outpost and turn it into a private resort. I turned the sonic cleanser on, watching the shimmering red-silver mist vanish into the drain. And before you ask, no, I am not interested. I moved to Ouroboros specifically to stop caring about who was killing whom for what amount of credits. Politics is just a fancy way of saying someone wants more bodies for the grinder. I have seen enough grinders. You are a strange human, Jackson Vane, she said, her voice softer now, lacking the sharp edge of command. You speak like a man who has died once already. 8 years in the military medical corps will do that to you, I replied, drying my hands on a towel that was more gray than white. I spent my youth patching up kids who were convinced they were immortal, only to watch them realize they were not. It tends to ruin your appreciation for grand gestures and heroic speeches. I walked back to her and held out a small cup of dark, steaming liquid. Drink this. It is a stimulant blocker. It will slow your heart rate enough to let the cellular regeneration stabilize. She took the cup, sniffing it suspiciously. It smells like despair and old copper. That is just the water on this station, I said, leaning against the counter. It has been through the recycler so many times it has forgotten it was ever part of a cloud. Drink up, Commander. She took a sip, grimaced, but finished the cup. Thank you. For the medicine or the terrible coffee? For not looking at me like I am a weapon, she said, her gaze fixed on the empty cup. It has been a long time since someone saw the wound before they saw the rank. Well, do not get used to it, I said, though I felt a strange tug in my chest that I had not felt in years. Tomorrow I am going to yell at you about your lack of rest, and the day after that, I will probably find something else to be annoyed about. I look forward to it, she whispered, and for the first time, a small, genuine smile touched her lips. I helped her off the table, letting her lean on me as we walked to the small recovery room. I could feel the heat radiating from her skin, the raw power of her species contained within a body that was currently fragile and human-like in its suffering. I got her settled into the bed, adjusted the thermal blanket, and made sure the call button was within reach. Get some rest, I said, heading for the door. I will be back in 4 hours to check your vitals, and try not to perform any orbital maneuvers in your sleep. Jackson? I stopped at the threshold, my hand on the light switch. Yeah? Why are you really helping me? You know the risk. If the coil finds me here, they will level this entire level of the station. I looked out the small porthole in the hallway, watching the rain wash against the reinforced glass. Because the floor was already dirty, I said, my voice low, and because everyone deserves a place where they are just a person, even if it is only for a few hours in a rusted-out clinic at the end of the universe. I flipped the switch, leaving her in the soft amber glow of the emergency lights. As I walked back to my desk to start the paperwork, I found myself checking the charge on my old military-grade pulse pistol. I had told her I did not care about the war, but the universe had a funny way of dragging you back into the fight, whether you were ready or not. I sat down, poured myself a cup of that soul-crushing coffee, and waited for the trouble I knew was coming. The proximity alarm on Ouroboros Outpost did not sound like a siren. It was more of a low-frequency hum that vibrated through the floorboards and made the teeth of every long-term resident ache with a familiar, dull dread. It was 4 a.m, station time, when that hum started, which meant that whoever was approaching was either incredibly desperate or looking for a fight. Given my recent house guest, I was leaning toward the latter. I rolled out of my narrow cot, my joints popping like dry twigs. I pulled on my discarded shirt, the fabric still smelling faintly of antiseptic, and that silver-red, salary blood that seemed to linger on everything it touched. I walked to the main console in the kitchen area, tapping the glass screen to pull up the external security feeds. Outside, the artificial rain was falling in thick, oily curtains against the black void of space. 3 ships were drifting into the docking corridor of Sector 9. They were sleek, needle-shaped vessels with matte black hulls that drank the dim orange light of the station's navigational beacons. No markings, no transponder codes, and enough weapons hardpoints to turn Ouroboros into a cloud of glowing dust. Well, hell, I whispered to the empty room. There goes the neighborhood. I checked the sensor readings. They were broadcasting civilian emergency codes, the kind of digital signal that screamed for medical assistance and docking priority. It was a clever play. The station's automated systems were designed to prioritize life support emergencies, which meant these high-speed interceptors were getting the fast track to my front door while the dock workers were still rubbing the sleep from their eyes. I went to the recovery room. Zilara was already awake. She was sitting on the edge of the bed, her back straight as a spear, watching the door with a focus that made the air in the room feel heavy. She had found her boots, though I noticed her left hand was still hovering near her bandaged side. She looked like a ghost illuminated by the amber emergency lights, a beautiful and terrifying spirit of war. "They are here," she said. It was not a question. I leaned against the doorframe, crossing my arms. 3 interceptors. Ghost class, if I had to guess. They are using civilian distress pings to bypass the manual inspection. Clever, really. Most of the gearheads on this station are too tired or too drunk to notice the difference between a freighter and a tactical strike craft. How long, she asked. 20 minutes until they clear the airlock. Maybe 10 more until they find their way to this level. This station is a labyrinth of rusted corridors and dead ends. But the obsidian coil usually travels with high-end thermal trackers. They will find the luminescent signature of your blood easily enough. I watched her face, looking for fear. I found only a cold, calculating resolve. She began to stand, but the effort made her face go pale, the silver sweat of her species beating on her forehead. "Sit down," I commanded, my voice flat. "You are still a patient, not a frontline grunt. I cannot hide in a bed while my enemies come for my head, Jackson. I am a commander of the hegemony. If I am to die, I will die with a blade in my hand, not a thermal blanket around my shoulders." I walked over to her, putting my hands on her shoulders and forcing her back down. It was a bold move, touching a Salari warrior like that, but I was too tired for protocol. "Listen to me, you stubborn noble. You have 34 sutures holding your internal organs together. You try to play hero right now, and you will be a pile of very expensive scrap metal before you clear the hallway." She grabbed my wrist, her grip like a vice even in her weakened state. "Why do you care? You could hand me over. You could tell them I broke in, that you were a victim, and you could walk away with enough marks to buy a planet in the inner systems. Why are you still standing here?" I looked her in the eyes, ignoring the way my heart was hammering against my ribs. "Because I already told you, you are my patient. And because I really, really hate it when people make a mess in my clinic." I pulled my wrist away, turning to the cabinet where I kept the heavy-duty stabilizers. "I need to know why they are really here, Zalera. 12 trained operatives for one wounded general? That is not an assassination. That is a recovery mission. What are you carrying?" She was quiet for a long moment, the only sound the distant clank of the docking clamps engaging, the sound of the trap closing. "It is not a thing," she said finally. "It is me." I frowned, checking the injector levels. "Explain. The Scileri are not just born, Jackson. We are designed. My blood. It contains the primary sequence for the Genesis core. It is a biological encryption key. With it, the obsidian coil can bypass the planetary shields of our home systems. Without it, I am just a soldier. With it, I am the end of my people." I stopped what I was doing, the weight of her words sinking in like lead. "So you are not just a general. You are the master key to a genocide." "I am a weapon," she said, her voice devoid of emotion. "That is all I have ever been. That is why they fear me. That is why they want me. To them, I am not a woman or a leader. I am a tactical advantage that must be secured or destroyed." I looked at the small, fragile woman sitting on my recovery bed. I saw the way she clutched her side. I saw the exhaustion in the set of her jaw. To the galaxy, she was a legend or a threat. To me, she was just another soul being crushed by the weight of things she never asked for. "Well," I said, tossing her a small portable shield generator from my emergency kit. "To me, you are just a stubborn woman who needs to stop bleeding on my furniture. And as far as I am concerned, the clinic is currently closed to unannounced visitors." I checked the pulse pistol at my hip. It was an old model, a leftover from my days with the 3rd Fleet, but I had kept it clean. I checked the power cell, seeing the blue light glow with a steady, reliable hum. "I have a plan," I said, looking at her. "It is a terrible plan. It involves a lot of property damage and a very high probability of us both getting blown to bits." She looked at the shield generator in her hand, then up at me. A slow, dangerous smile spread across her face. "I have always been a fan of terrible plans, human." "Good," I said, heading for the main treatment room. "Then let us see if we can teach these obsidian bastards that even at the edge of the universe, the doctor is always in. The preparation for a siege is a rhythmic, almost meditative process. You do not think about the dying. You think about the angles. You think about the cover. You think about the 1,000 ways a door can become a choke point and how a medical scanner can be repurposed into a very expensive flashbang." I was currently dragging a heavy crate of pressurized oxygen tanks toward the main entrance. In the military, we called this improvising. In civilian life, it was probably considered a felony. I did not care. My clinic was a small, three-room affair at the end of a long, blind hallway. It was defensible, provided you were willing to be ruthless. "Jackson," Zalara called out from the doorway of the recovery room. She was leaning against the frame, her face still pale but her eyes sharp and alert. She had traded her ruined tunic for one of my spare medical coats, which was far too large for her, making her look strangely vulnerable. "I have the shield generator active. It is at 85%. Keep it that way," I grunted, positioning the tanks near the thermal seal of the door. "If they breach, I want you in the back room. There is a ventilation shaft behind the primary synthesizer. It leads to the lower waste levels. If things go foobar, you bug out. Do not wait for me." "I am not a coward, Jackson. I do not hide while my doctor plays soldier." "You are not a soldier right now, you are a liability," I snapped, not looking up. My hands were busy rewiring the clinic's fire suppression system. "If you get shot again, I have to spend another 4 hours sewing you up, and I am out of the good anesthetic. So do me a favor and stay in the back." She didn't move. "You are a very strange human. Most of your kind would be begging for their lives or trying to negotiate a finder's fee by now. Why do you risk so much for a stranger who has brought nothing but trouble to your door?" I paused, my fingers hovering over the red and yellow wires of the suppression unit. Because for 8 years, I watched the high and mighty of the galaxy treat people like statistics. I saw commanders order thousands to their desks because it looked good on a tactical map. I saw medics get shot because they were trying to save someone from the other side. I looked at her, the blue sparks of the wiring reflecting in my eyes. "I came out here to be ordinary, Zalara. And being ordinary means looking at a wounded person and seeing a person, not a key to a genocide or a tactical asset. If I let them take you, then I am just another gear in that damn machine. And I am done being a gear." She was silent for a long moment. "I have lived for 30 years, and I have had more titles than I can count. Princess, General, Spear of the Hegemony, Savior of Krell. But I think I prefer being a person, even if it means drinking your terrible coffee." I actually laughed at that, a short, dry sound that felt like sandpaper in my throat. "Careful, Commander. If you keep saying nice things, I might start thinking you actually like me." I finished the wiring and tapped the control panel. The clinic's overhead lights flickered once and then turned a deep, warning red. The fire suppression system was now rigged to release a concentrated cloud of medical-grade knockout gas the moment the door was breached. It wouldn't kill the obsidian coil operatives, but it would slow them down long enough for me to make their lives very difficult. I walked over to my desk and pulled out a small, silver disc. "This is a cortex jammer," I said, holding it up. "It is meant for high-pain neural surgeries, but if I overcharge the pulse, it will scramble the tactical visors of anyone within 5 meters. It is my one-shot wonder." "You are weaponizing a medical facility," she noted, her voice tinged with a strange kind of respect. "It is a frontier tradition," I said, checking my pulse pistol one last time. "We call it aggressive medicine." A sudden, sharp metallic bang echoed through the hallway outside. It was followed by the hiss of a plasma torch. They were at the outer perimeter. "Show time," I whispered. I pointed toward the recovery room. "Back. Now." "That is not a request, Zalara. It is a medical order." She looked at me, a flurry of emotions crossing her face. Defiance, gratitude, and something else I couldn't quite name. Then she nodded, a short, sharp movement of her head, and retreated into the darkness of the back room. I took my position behind the primary examination table, crouching low and checking the line of sight to the door. I could hear them now. They weren't trying to be quiet anymore. They knew I was here. They knew she was here. The sound of heavy, armored boots clicking on the metal floor was like a countdown. 1 operative, maybe 2, I calculated. They will lead with a flashbang. Standard breach protocol. I closed my eyes and covered my ears, counting the seconds. The explosion was a dull roar that shook the entire clinic, shattering the few glass vials I had left on the shelves. White light seethed through the cracks in my eyelids, followed by the acrid smell of ozone. I didn't wait. I triggered the fire suppression system. A thick, white mist hissed from the ceiling vents, filling the room in a matter of seconds. I heard the door kick open, the sound of heavy metal hitting the floor. Two shadows emerged through the fog, their tactical visors glowing with a sinister red light. "Hold your fire," a voice shouted, harsh and distorted by a vocoder. "We want the asset alive. The doctor is expendable." The first operative stepped into the room, his weapon sweeping the area with professional efficiency. He didn't see me until I was already moving. I didn't fire the pistol. Instead, I kicked the oxygen tanks I had rigged earlier. They didn't explode, but the sudden release of pressurized gas acted like a rocket, slamming the heavy canisters into the operative's legs. He went down with a cry of pain, his weapon firing a wild burst of plasma into the ceiling. The second operative roared and turned toward me, his finger tightening on the trigger. I dove behind the examination table as a bolt of blue energy scorched the air where my head had been a second before. I reached up and triggered the cortex jammer. The air in the room seemed to ripple with static. A high-pitched whine erupted from the device, and the second operative grabbed his helmet, screaming as the overcharged signal fried his neural interface. He stumbled back, his movements jerky and uncoordinated, before collapsing into a heap on the floor. "Two down," I breathed, my heart racing so fast I thought it might burst. 10 to go. A third operative appeared in the doorway, his silhouette framed by the orange light of the hallway. He didn't have a tactical visor. He had a heavy-duty riot shield and a pulse rifle that looked like it could punch through a tank. "Dr. Vane," the operative said, his voice calm and cold. "You are making this very difficult for yourself. Step aside and give us the general. We have no interest in your petty little clinic." I stood up, my pulse pistol leveled at his chest. "I already told your friends. The clinic is closed for the night, and I don't give up my patients to thugs in black armor." "You are a fool," the man said, raising his rifle. "You are dying for a woman who has killed thousands. You are dying for a monster." I tightened my grip on the pistol, the blue light of the power cell reflecting in my sweat-streaked face. "Maybe she is a monster to you, but in here, she is just a person, and that is worth more than any credit bounty you can offer." I fired. The pulse bolt hit his shield, a cascade of sparks illuminating the room. He didn't flinch. He began to move forward, the heavy shield absorbing my shots with ease. I backed away, my mind racing. I was out of tricks, my traps were spent, and my pistol wasn't strong enough to punch through that armor. I reached the doorway of the recovery room, my back hitting the frame. I looked over my shoulder, hoping Zylara had found the ventilation shaft. She was standing right behind me. She wasn't hiding. She had found my old military-grade bone saw, a heavy vibrating blade designed to cut through reinforced carbon fiber. It was humming in her hand, a low, lethal vibration that matched the fire in her eyes. "I told you, Jackson," she said, her voice steady and cold. "I am not a coward." She stepped past me, her movement a blur of silver and white. Despite her wounds, she moved with the grace of a dancer and the lethality of a hurricane. The operative tried to raise his shield, but she was too fast. She dove low, the bone saw cutting through the armored joints of his knees with a screech of rending metal. The man went down with a howl, his shield clattering to the floor. Zylara didn't stop. She spun, using the momentum to kick the rifle from his hands before pressing the humming blade against the seal of his helmet. "Yield!" she commanded, her voice like a winter wind. The man froze, his breathing ragged and terrified. Zylara looked back at me, her face splattered with black hydraulic fluid and red human blood. She looked like the goddess of war the manuals described. But then she winced, her hand going to her side, and for a second, I saw the pain return to her eyes. I moved to her side, catching her before she could fall. "I told you," I muttered, though there was no heat in it. "You are going to tear the stitches." "I think I already did," she whispered, leaning heavily against me. "But it was worth it." We stood there in the wreckage of my clinic, surrounded by the unconscious bodies of the galaxy's most dangerous assassins. Outside, I could hear the sounds of more boots, more weapons, more trouble. The obsidian coil wouldn't stop here. They would keep coming until they had what they wanted. "We need to go," I said, looking at the ventilation shaft. "I cannot run forever, Jackson," she said, her head resting against my shoulder. "Eventually they will catch me, and they will take what is inside me. Not tonight they won't, I said, helping her toward the back of the room. We are going to the waste levels. It is dark, it smells like a sewer, and even thermal trackers have trouble through the lead shielding down there. It is the most ordinary place on this station. She looked at me, a small, tired smile on her face. You really are an odd human, Jackson Vane. And you are a terrible patient, I countered, helping her into the shaft. But I suppose we are both stuck with each other for now. We disappeared into the dark, leaving behind the only home I had known for 5 years. I didn't look back. I didn't think about the credits I had lost or the life I had built. I only thought about the weight of the woman leaning on me and the strange, stubborn hope that maybe, just maybe, being ordinary was enough to change the galaxy. The waste levels of Ouroboros Outpost were not designed for the living. They were a subterranean nightmare of lead-lined conduits, churning filtration vats, and the heavy, humid stench of 1,000 years of recycled biological decay. Down here, the orange emergency lights of the upper sectors were replaced by a sickly, flickering green luminescence from the algae tanks that processed the station's oxygen. It was a place where the air felt like wet wool in your lungs, and every footstep echoed against the rusted bulkheads like a gunshot. I was carrying Xylara's weight more than I liked to admit. Her breathing was a ragged, wet whistle, a sign that the exertion of the fight had pushed her Solari physiology past its breaking point. Every few meters, she would stumble, her hand clutching the blood-soaked fabric of my oversized medical coat. "Zip it," I hissed, though she hadn't said a word. My own nerves were fried, humming with the static of too much adrenaline and not enough sleep. If you keep dragging that left boot, every thermal script in the sector is going to hear us coming from a kilometer away. I am trying, Jackson, she whispered, her voice tight with a pain she refused to fully acknowledge. My core, it is struggling to regulate. The stabilization medicine you gave me is fighting the adrenaline. That's because you decided to play samurai with a bone saw instead of staying in the damn bed, I muttered, though I adjusted my grip, pulling her arm tighter across my shoulders. Just give me another 200 meters. There's a maintenance hub near the primary sulfur vats. It's shielded from the station's internal sensors. Even those black armor goons won't find us there. We moved through a forest of vertical pipes, the metal slick with a thick, oily condensation that smelled of old ozone and sulfur. This was the digestive system of the station, the place where the ordinary people were stripped of their utility and turned back into raw chemistry. It was a fitting place for a disgraced medic and a fallen general to hide. Wait, Xylara said suddenly, her body tensing. I froze, my hand flying to the grip of my pulse pistol. I scanned the shadows, my eyes straining against the dim green light. What is it? You hear a patrol? No, she breathed, her amber eyes widening. Not a patrol. Something humming. A collective resonance. I frowned, listening. At first there was nothing but the rhythmic thrum of the pumps. Then I heard it, a low melodic chanting, coming from the shadows of the massive filtration tanks ahead. It wasn't the sound of machines, it was the sound of voices. Scavengers, I whispered, a cold knot forming in my stomach. The rats of Sector 9. I thought they stayed near the thermal vents. They are not just scavengers, Xylara said, her Solari senses picking up nuances I couldn't perceive. There is a desperation in their frequency, a hunger. Before I could respond, a dozen figures emerged from the gloom. They weren't wearing the high-tech armor of the obsidian coil. These were the discarded souls of Ouroboros, men and women wrapped in layers of scavenged thermal plastic, their faces hidden behind crude breathers. They held makeshift spears tipped with sharpened turbine blades and old model arc welders that crackled with unstable energy. A tall figure stepped forward, his breather clicking as he inhaled the toxic air. He carried a heavy-duty plasma cutter like a ceremonial staff. Dr. Vane, the figure said, his voice a gravelly rasp. A long way from your clean clinic, aren't you? I recognized the voice. It was Karis, a man who had once been a foreman in the scrap yards until a localized radiation leak turned his lungs into scar tissue. I had treated him 6 months ago, traded him a week's worth of lung expanders for a crate of salvaged cooling coils. Karis, I said, keeping my pistol lowered but my thumb on the safety. I'm just passing through. I have a patient who needs a quiet place to sit for a few hours. No trouble. Karis looked at Zalera, his gaze lingering on her pointed ears and the shimmering silver blood on her coat. The whole station is buzzing about the spear of the hegemony. They say the big wigs in the obsidian coil are offering 50,000 marks for her, alive or flatlined. Do you know how many lung filters that buys for my people, Doctor? The air grew thick with a different kind of tension. My heart hammered against my ribs. I looked at the scavengers, their eyes hollow and desperate, and then at Silera, who was already shifting her weight, her hand hovering near the bone saw she had tucked into her waistband. She's not a bounty, Karis, I said, my voice low and steady. She's a person, a wounded one. You know the code of the waste levels. You don't prey on the sick. The code doesn't fill empty bellies, a woman shouted from the back, her arc welder spitting blue sparks. She's a monster, a Solari general. How many of our kind has she zeroed in the frontier wars? Xylara flinched, the word monster hitting her harder than any vibroblade. She looked at me, a silent, agonizing question in her eyes. Is this what I am to them? She didn't start the wars, I said, stepping in front of her, and she's not the one who turned your lungs to ash, Karis. That was the synaptic union and their safety protocols. If you take her, you're just doing their dirty work for them. You're becoming the very thing that broke you. Karis stared at me, the red light of his breather pulsing with his labored breaths. The scavengers shifted, their makeshift weapons trembling. I could see the battle playing out in their minds, the need for survival clashing with the residual scrap of dignity they had left. The obsidian coil is already in the waste levels, Karis said finally, his shoulders sagging. They didn't ask for permission. They zeroed 3 of my scouts near the intake valves. They aren't looking for a person, Doctor. They are looking for a prize. Then help us, I said, taking a gamble that made my skin crawl. Show us a way to the secondary filtration hub. If we stay here, they'll turn this whole level into a furnace trying to find her. You want them out of your home? Help me get her to the extraction point. Karis hesitated, then looked at his people. He saw the fear in their eyes. He knew that if the obsidian coil brought the fight here, the scavengers would be the first to be collateral. Follow, Karis rasped, turning back into the shadows. But if the black armor finds us, you are on your own, Vane. We don't die for a legend. I'm not asking you to, I said, helping Zalara forward. Just for a little bit of ordinary mercy. As we followed the scavengers through the labyrinth of pipes, Zalara leaned close to my ear. Why did you say that, she whispered. About me being a person? Because if they think you're a weapon, they have to fear you or control you, I said, my eyes scanning the dark. But if they think you're a person, they might just find a reason to let you live. It's the only play we have left. The secondary filtration hub was a cathedral of rust. Giant, rotating cylinders hummed with a bone-shaking vibration, churning the station's gray water into something resembling life. The air was thick with the mist of high-pressure sprays, creating a perpetual fog that made everything look ghostly and unsubstantial. Karis had left us at the entrance to a maintenance crawl space, his parting look one of grim pity. The coil is 10 minutes behind you, he had warned. They have bioscanners that can smell a Solari heartbeat from 2 kilometers away. You're ghosting yourself if you stay still. I got Xylara settled behind a heavy lead-shielded manifold. Her face was gray, the bioluminescence in her skin flickering like a dying bulb. I reached into my kit, my fingers fumbling with the last of the synthetic flesh stimulators. I need to check those sutures, I said, my voice echoing in the hollow space. Jackson, she said, her hand stopping mine. Her touch was cold, the heat of her core fading. If they catch us, if it looks like they will take me alive, I need you to do something. I didn't like the look in her eyes. It was the look of a soldier preparing for a scorched earth retreat. Zip lip, I'm not killing you, Xylara. Not kill me, she said, her grip tightening. The Genesis core, the sequence in my blood, it is volatile. If my core temperature reaches 45 degrees, the sequence degrades into useless proteins. There is a thermal overload setting on your medical scanner. You can use it to flash heat my blood. That would cause massive organ failure, I snapped, pulling my hand away. It would be slow, agonizing, and I'm pretty sure it qualifies as a war crime. I'm a doctor, not an incinerator. And I am a weapon that cannot be allowed to fall into their hands, she hissed, the intensity of her voice making her cough, a spray of silver blood hitting the floor. Do you realize what they will do with that key? They won't just bypass shields, Jackson. They will use it to rewrite the genetic code of my people. They will turn an entire race into mindless drones for their empire. Is my ordinary life worth that cost? I stood there, the humming of the filtration tanks filling the silence between us. This was the turning point I had been dreading. I had spent years running from the big picture, focusing on the one life in front of me, because the big picture was always written in blood. But now the one life in front of me was the big picture. Everyone is just a person, Zylara, I said, my voice shaking. That's what I told myself. That's how I survived. If I start deciding who is worth more than a billion others, I'm right back in the Third Fleet, signing death warrants for kids who don't know any better. Then you are a fool, she whispered, turning her head away. A kind, brave fool who doesn't understand the world he lives in. Maybe, I said, reaching for the stimulator. But I'm the only fool you've got right now. The sound of a heavy metal door slamming open at the far end of the hub cut through the white noise of the pumps. I didn't need a sensor to know who it was. The rhythmic, synchronized footsteps of armored boots spoke of professional killers. They are here, I whispered, dousing the green lights of the hub and pulling Zylara deeper into the shadow of the manifold. We watched through a gap in the machinery as 6 obsidian coil operatives fanned out across the catwalks. They were using high-intensity searchlights that cut through the mist like knives. They moved with a terrifying predatory grace, their weapons held at a low-ready position. In the center of the group was a man in a different kind of armor, slimmer, more ornate, with a helmet that resembled a stylized skull. He carried no weapon, but the way the others moved around him told me he was the one in charge. General Zylara, Ati, the man shouted, his voice amplified by the station's intercom system, echoing through the cathedral of rust. I know you are here, and I know you are wounded. Why continue this farce? You are a creature of logic and strategy. You know the odds. Your human companion cannot save you. He can barely save himself. Zylara's breath hitched. She looked at the bone saw in her lap, then at me. Dr. Vane, the leader continued, his voice dripping with mock sincerity. We have your service record, 8 years in the medical corps, a dozen commendations for bravery under fire. You were a hero once. Why throw that away for a biological asset that doesn't even belong to your species? Step out, and we will grant you safe passage to the inner systems. You can have a real clinic again, a real life. I looked at the pulse pistol in my hand. It felt heavy, like it was made of lead. The real life he was offering was a lie, a shiny gold coin tossed to a beggar before the execution. I knew how the obsidian coil worked. They didn't leave witnesses. But then, I saw something that made my blood run cold. One of the scavengers, a boy no older than 14, one of Kara's scouts, had been caught. He was being dragged forward by 2 of the operatives, his small body trembling in their armored grip. We found a local friend, the leader said, his voice cold. He says he knows where you are hiding. I'm sure he'd love to see you do the right thing, Doctor. The boy screamed as one of the operatives twisted his arm. It was a sharp, high-pitched sound that cut through the mechanical hum of the hub. Zylara looked at the boy, then at me. Don't, she whispered. It is a trap. I know, I said, my jaw clenching. I looked at the boy, and for a second, I didn't see a scavenger. I saw every soldier I couldn't save. I saw the cost of my ordinary philosophy. If I stayed hidden, the boy would die. If I stepped out, we would all die. The humanistic theme I had clung to was being shredded by the reality of the black armor. Was every person truly equal? Was the life of this one boy worth the secret Zylara carried? Was it worth the billions of Scileri lives that would be lost if the obsidian coil got the Genesis core? I closed my eyes, the cold mist of the filtration hub dampening my face. My mind raced through 1,000 tactical scenarios, looking for the one where no one had to die. There wasn't one. The big picture was here, and it was demanding its tribute. Jackson, stay down, Zylara commanded, her voice regaining a ghost of its former authority. I didn't listen. I couldn't. I stood up, stepping out from behind the lead shielding and into the harsh glare of the searchlights. I held my pulse pistol in one hand and my medical kit in the other. "Let the kid go," I shouted, my voice cracking but loud. "You want the general? She's right here. But the boy has nothing to do with this." The searchlights converged on me, blinding me for a second. I heard the click of a dozen weapons being taken off safety. "The hero returns," the leader said, stepping forward. "I was wondering when your conscience would get the better of your common sense, Vane." He signaled to the operatives holding the boy. They threw the kid to the ground and he scrambled away into the shadows, his sobbing lost in the roar of the pumps. "Now," the leader said, his skull helmet tilting as he looked at me. "Where is she?" "She's behind the manifold," I said, my heart feeling like a trapped bird in my chest. "But she's dying. Her core is failing. If you want her alive, you need me to stabilize her. You move in now with your brute force, and you'll be handing a corpse to your employers." The leader paused. I could see him calculating. He knew I was a medic. He knew Zylara was wounded. He also knew that a dead asset was worth significantly less than a living one. "Step away from the manifold, Doctor," the leader said, gesturing with his hand. "We will take it from here." "No," I said, leveling my pistol at a nearby high-pressure steam valve. "You stay where you are. I'm going to administer a stabilizer. Once she's stable, I'll step aside. You try to rush us, and I'll blow this valve. The steam in these pipes is 500 degrees Celsius. It will melt the seals on your armor and boil you inside your suits before you can even fire a shot." It was a bluff, a desperate, terrifying bluff. The steam would kill me and Zylara too. The leader stared at me. I could feel the weight of his gaze, the assessment of a man who dealt in death. "You would die for her?" he asked, a hint of genuine curiosity in his voice. "I'm not dying for her," I said, my finger tightening on the trigger. "I'm dying for my patient. There's a difference." Suddenly, the floor beneath us groaned. A massive vibration shook the hub, followed by the sound of tearing metal. One of the primary filtration cylinders had failed, its internal pressure exceeding its structural limits. The explosion wasn't a roar, it was a scream of steam and shrapnel. The manifold I was standing near was ripped from its mountings, and a wall of scalding gray water erupted into the hub. I was thrown back by the force of the blast, my pulse pistol clattering into the depths of the filtration tanks. Through the chaos and the blinding steam, I saw Zylara. She wasn't hiding anymore. She had used the distraction to lunge at the nearest operative, her bone saw flashing in the green light. But she was weak. She stumbled, and the leader of the obsidian coil was already moving, his own vibroblade humming to life. I scrambled to my feet, my vision blurred by steam and tears. I had no weapon. I had no traps left. I only had my medical kit and the desperate, stubborn belief that I could save her. "Zylara!" I screamed. She looked at me, her face illuminated by a sudden flare of light from the broken machinery. In that moment, she didn't look like a general or a weapon. She looked like a woman who was tired of running. I dove toward her, my hands reaching for the thermal overload setting on my scanner. I had to make a choice: save her life and risk the galaxy, or destroy her secret and lose the only person who had treated me like a human being in 5 years. The cost of my ordinary philosophy was finally here, and it was more than I ever thought I could pay. The world vanished into a screaming wall of white. The steam from the ruptured filtration cylinder didn't just burn, it erased the horizon, turning the cathedral of rust into a sensory vacuum. I couldn't see the leader of the obsidian coil. I couldn't see the boy who had just scampered into the dark. I could only hear the high-pitched whistle of the high-pressure leak and the ragged, wet cough of Zylara somewhere to my left. I moved on instinct, my hands sweeping the floor until they found the familiar cold plastic of my medical kit. My lungs burned with every breath of the scalding mist. I crawled toward the sound of her coughing, my knees scraping against the jagged metal grating. "Zylara!" I shouted, the sound swallowed by the roar of the steam. I found her slumped against a vibrating pipe, her hands still clutching the bone saw, though her fingers were beginning to slip. Her amber eyes were clouded, the gold flecks dull. The steam was cooking her from the outside, and her internal core was trying to compensate by dumping more heat, creating a lethal feedback loop. I looked at the scanner in my hand. The red light for the thermal overload setting was blinking, a silent invitation to end the threat, to destroy the Genesis core, and to kill the woman who had just saved my life. I looked at her, really looked at her through the haze. She wasn't a weapon. She wasn't a general. She was just a person who had spent 30 years being told she was something else. Damn the big picture, I whispered. I didn't trigger the overload. Instead, I flipped the scanner to its maximum therapeutic output, a risky, untested setting designed to stabilize Solari heart valves during deep space surgery. It was essentially a localized EMP for the body, a shock meant to force the nervous system to reboot. I pressed the scanner against her chest, right over the glowing plasma core. "Stay with me, you stubborn noble," I grunted. The pulse of blue energy was so bright it cut through the steam, a ripple of static that made my own arm go numb. Xylara's body jolted, her back arching as her core rhythm was forcibly reset. She gasped, a deep, shuddering inhale that sounded like someone coming back from the dead. But the pulse had a secondary effect I hadn't planned for. The EMP ripple hit the leader's skull helmet as he stepped through the steam, his vibroblade raised for a killing blow. The electronics in his armor shrieked, sparks cascading from his joints as his tactical HUD went dark. He stumbled, blinded and deafened, the ornate armor suddenly a lead coffin. "Time to go," I yelled, grabbing Xylara's arm. She was dazed, her movement sluggish, but she was alive. I hauled her up, throwing her arm over my shoulder with a strength I didn't know I had. We didn't head for the exit. We headed for the depths. We dove into the secondary drainage culvert, a dark, narrow tunnel filled with knee-deep gray water that smelled of chemicals and failure. We waded through the dark for what felt like miles, the sound of the pursuit fading into the background hum of the station. My lungs were raw, and my shoulder was a map of fire where Xylara's weight pressed down. "Jackson," she whispered, her head lolling against mine. "Why? Why didn't you do it? You had the chance. You could have saved your galaxy." I didn't stop. I kept moving, my boots splashing through the oily water. "I told you, Xylara, I'm a doctor. I don't trade lives for math. Besides, I already told the bigwigs to screw themselves 8 years ago. I'm not about to start listening to them now." We finally reached a junction where the drainage pipes met the primary lead-shielded casing for the station's reactor core. It was dry here, though the air was hot and tasted of static. I lowered her to the ground, my hands trembling as I reached for my medical kit. I needed to see the damage. I needed to know if I had saved her or just delayed the inevitable. I pulled back the medical coat and my heart sank. The sutures had torn completely. The glowing silver blood was pulsing out in a slow, steady rhythm that meant we were losing the battle against time. Her skin was turning a translucent gray, the bone structure beneath visible like a skeletal map. "Listen to me," she said, her voice a mere thread of sound. "The leader, he will not stop. He has the orbital codes. He will vent the atmosphere of Sector 9 to find us." "Let him try," I said, fumbling for the last of the biosynthetic sealant. "I've lived through planetary sieges, Xylara. A little vacuum doesn't scare me. But you need to stay awake. Talk to me. Tell me about the home systems. Tell me what it's like when you're not playing general." She looked up at the ceiling, her eyes focusing on something far away. "It is green, not the sickly green of the algae tanks, a deep, vibrant emerald. The sky is the color of a bruised plum, and the oceans, they sing. The water has a resonance that matches our cores. When I was a child before the academies, I used to sit by the shore and listen to the world talk to me." She coughed, a spray of silver hitting her chin. "They took that away. They told me the resonance was a distraction. They told me I was meant for the silence of the void, for the command deck, for the slaughter. Well, the command deck is a long way from here," I said, applying the sealant with a hand that was finally steady. "Right now, you're just a girl who likes the plum-colored sky. And I'm just a guy who makes terrible coffee. That's the reality that matters." She smiled, a fragile thing that made my throat tighten. "I think I would like to see that sky again. Not as a weapon, just as Thiston." "Thiston," I repeated, the name feeling right. "Nice to meet you, Thiston. I'm Jackson." The peace was broken by a sudden, violent vibration in the floor. It wasn't the pumps, it was a docking maneuver. A big one. "That is not the coil," Xylara Thiston said, her eyes sharpening. "That is a hegemony carrier. The Third Fleet has arrived." I didn't feel relief. I felt a cold, sinking dread. The hegemony didn't send a carrier for a person. They sent it for a strategic asset. I suppose your ride is here, I said, trying to keep the bitterness out of my voice. Jackson, she said, grabbing my hand. They will not understand. They will see you as an obstacle or a witness. I've been both before, I said, checking the sealant one last time. I'm getting good at it. Now sit still. I'm not done with these sutures, and I don't care if the whole damn fleet is waiting. I worked in the dim light of the reactor casing, sewing a legendary warrior back together while the galaxy hammered at the door. I chose her again and again with every stitch. I chose the person over the politics. I chose the patient over the prize. And for the first time in 8 years, I didn't feel like a ghost. I felt like a man who had finally found something worth the fight. The rescue was not a rescue. It was a tactical acquisition. The doors to the drainage junction didn't open. They were vaporized by a precision plasma charge. 6 Solari honor guards clad in shimmering white gold plate armor that made the obsidian coil look like street thugs flooded into the small dry space. Their weapons were pointed not at the darkness behind us, but directly at me. "Secure the asset," a voice boomed, resonant and cold. A tall Solari man stepped through the smoke. He wore the robes of a high arbiter, his silver hair braided with strands of actual gold. His eyes were the color of ice, and they swept over the filth-streaked walls of the junction with a look of profound disgust. "Arbiter Valen," Thiston whispered, her hand tightening on mine. The Arbiter didn't look at her. He looked at me, his lip curling. "Step away from the commander, human. You are in violation of approximately 45 inter-system treaties by merely touching her." I didn't move. I was sitting on the floor, my hands still covered in Thiston's blood, holding a needle and a length of nanothread. "She's not a commander right now. She's a patient with a grade 4 abdominal laceration and signs of metabolic shock, and you're contaminating my surgical field." The guards moved closer, the tips of their energy spears humming with a lethal charge. One of them, a woman with a scar across her cheek, stepped forward and leveled her weapon at my throat. "Zero him," the guard said, her voice devoid of emotion. "He is a civilian witness to a great Alpha secret." "No!" Thiston shouted, trying to sit up. The effort cost her, and she collapsed back against the lead casing, her breathing coming in jagged gas. He saved me. He protected the core." Arbiter Valen finally looked at her, but there was no warmth in his gaze. There was only the calculation of a man checking his inventory. "You have been compromised, Commander. Your disappearance has cost the hegemony 3 weeks of strategic planning and 2 billion marks in mobilization fees. You will be taken to the carrier for immediate extraction of the Genesis sequence. The human will be dealt with according to protocol." "Protocol is for people who follow rules, Arbiter," I said, standing up slowly. I was a head shorter than the Silari guards, and I was armed with nothing but a dirty lab coat and a blood-stained bone saw. But I had spent 8 years staring down death, and I wasn't about to blink now. "I'm her doctor. That gives me jurisdiction over her health until I sign the release forms, and I'm not signing anything until I know she's being treated as a person, not a thumb drive." The Arbiter laughed, a dry, hollow sound that echoed in the metallic chamber. "A doctor, on this rusted heap of a station? You are a scavenger, Vane, a parasite living off the scraps of the galaxy. You have no rights here. You have no standing." "I have standing because I'm the only one who knows how to keep her heart beating during the extraction," I lied, the words coming out smooth and confident. I knew their tech was advanced, but I also knew Solari biology was notoriously temperamental during shock. "The pulse scan I used to reset her core has created a bioresonance lock. You try to pull that sequence now with your standard equipment, and her core will go into a thermal overload. You'll get a pile of ash and a very large explosion, but you won't get your key." The Arbiter's eyes narrowed. He looked at his guards, then back at me. He was a politician, and politicians were always afraid of the one variable they couldn't control. "You are bluffing, human." "Try me," I said, stepping between the guards and Thiston. "I've got nothing to lose but a clinic that already smells like charred assassins. But you lose that core, and I'm guessing your career as an Arbiter is going to be very short and very painful." The standoff stretched. the silence in the chamber so thick you could taste it. I could feel Thiston's eyes on my back, a mixture of terror and awe. She knew I was lying. She knew I was a guy who barely understood the deep-level physics of the Genesis core. But she also knew I was the first person to ever stand up to the hegemony for her sake. "Protocol has changed," Valen said finally, his voice tight. "The human will accompany us to the carrier. He will assist with the stabilization. After that, we will see." The guards didn't lower their weapons, but they stepped back, forming a perimeter around us. Two of them brought forward a high-tech repulsor gurney, their movements efficient and impersonal. "Easy," I said, guiding them as they lifted Thiston onto the gurney. "She's sensitive to the vibration. Keep the inertial dampeners at 50%. As we were escorted through the waste levels toward the primary docking ring, the reality of the station's devastation became clear. The obsidian coil had been thorough. The scavengers' homes were scorched, the air heavy with the smell of ionized metal. I saw Karras near a pile of rubble, his breather cracked, being held at gunpoint by a Solari soldier. "Let him go," I said, stopping in my tracks. "Move, human," the guard behind me growled, shoving me with the butt of his spear. "No," I said, turning to face him. "Let him go or I stop walking. He helped us. He's a civilian." The guard looked at the Arbiter, who sighed with theatrical impatience. "Release the scavenger. He is beneath our notice anyway." Karras was shoved into the shadows. He looked at me, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and gratitude. I didn't say anything. I just nodded, a silent promise that I hadn't forgotten the ordinary mercy he had shown us. We reached the docking ring, where a shuttle was waiting to take us to the massive carrier hanging in the void above Ouroboros. The station looked small from here, a rusted needle floating in a sea of stars. It was a place I had hated for 5 years, a place I had called a prison. But as the shuttle doors closed, I felt a strange pang of loss. I was leaving the only place where I had been allowed to be just Jackson. The carrier, the Star Singer, was a cathedral of light and glass. It was beautiful, sterile, and utterly terrifying. We were taken directly to the high-security medical wing, a place of white walls and silent machines that made my clinic look like a Dark Age dungeon. Thiston was hooked up to a dozen different monitors, her vitals displayed in shimmering holograms that hovered over her bed. The Solari doctors, dressed in robes of silver silk, moved around her with the precision of clockwork, their faces masks of professional indifference. "Step back, human," one of the doctors said, pushing me away from the bed. "We will take over from here." "I'm staying," I said, my voice echoing in the sterile room. "I'm her primary care provider. I'm the only one she trusts." Thiston reached out, her fingers brushing mine. "Let him stay," she said, her voice stronger now, bolstered by the high-end nutrients they were pumping into her system. He is part of the sequence." The Solari doctors looked at the Arbiter, who was standing by the door. He nodded, a sharp, angry gesture. "Let him stay for the stabilization, but once the extraction begins, he is to be removed." I sat in a chair by her bed, watching the monitors. I knew the clock was ticking. They weren't interested in her recovery. They were interested in the harvest. They were going to pull the code from her blood, and they didn't care if she survived the process. "Jackson," she whispered when the doctors had moved to the other side of the room to consult on the holograms. "You need to leave. They will not let you go once they have what they want. You are a witness to their shame." "I'm not leaving you, Thiston," I said, leaning close to her ear. "I've spent 8 years running away from things. I'm done with that. I'm staying right here." "Why?" she asked, a single tear of silver blood tracking down her cheek. "Why me?" I looked at her and I realized that the answer was simple. It wasn't about the galaxy. It wasn't about the war. It was about the way she had looked at me when I was bandaging her wound. It was about the fact that she had seen me, really seen me, beneath the sarcasm and the dirt. "Because you're my patient," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "And because I think I'd like to see that plum-colored sky with you someday." She closed her eyes, her hand gripping mine with a strength that felt like a promise. "The sky is beautiful, Jackson. I will show you." But as I looked at the Arbiter and the silent, cold doctors, I knew that the battle for Thiston, the person, was just beginning. I had saved her from the obsidian coil, but now I had to save her from her own people. I had to prove that she was worth more than the key she carried. I looked at the high-tech scanners, the shimmering holograms, and the cold golden armor of the guards. I was just an ordinary man with a bad attitude and a medical degree from a forgotten university. But I was the only thing standing between Thyssen and the void. I straightened my shoulders, adjusted my dirty lab coat, and prepared for the final round. The big picture was screaming at me again, but all I could hear was the steady, stubborn beat of a heart that I had sewn back together with my own two hands. The air inside the medical wing of the Star Singer didn't just smell like antiseptic. It smelled like the absence of life. It was a vacuum of clinical perfection, a sharp contrast to the humid, sulfurous breath of Ouroboros outpost. Here the walls were constructed from ivory-toned ceramic polymers that absorbed sound, turning every footstep into a dull, muffled heartbeat. I sat in a high-backed chair made of molded light alloy, watching the shimmering holographic displays that hovered over Thyssen. 36 hours had passed since we were hauled into the belly of this beast. In that time, I had slept for exactly 45 minutes, slumped against the cold wall of the observation deck until a Solari guard nudged me with the humming tip of an energy spear. My hands were finally clean, the silver blood scrubbed from under my fingernails by a sonic shower, but my mind felt like it was still back in that drainage junction, wading through the gray water and the dark. "Her core rhythm is fluctuating again," one of the Solari doctors said, her voice like wind over glass. She didn't look at me. To her, I was a primitive curiosity, a biological anomaly that had somehow managed to stitch together a piece of high-tier hegemony hardware. The stabilization human vein provided is unconventional. It lacks the harmonic resonance of our standard protocols. "It's called keeping her alive," I snapped, my voice sounding gravelly and raw in the silent room. "Your standard protocols involve treating her like a malfunctioning jump drive. If you want her heart to keep beating, you need to stop over-calibrating the neural link. Her brain is trying to process trauma, not just data streams." The doctor paused, her fingers hovering over a light interface. She turned to look at me, her amber eyes narrowed in a mix of irritation and genuine confusion. "Trauma is an organic inefficiency, human. The commander has been trained since her first decade to bypass such distractions. What you see as suffering is merely a temporary synchronization error." I stood up, my joints screaming in protest. I walked over to the bed, ignoring the way the two honor guards by the door tensed, their hands hovering near their pulse rifles. I looked down at Thyssen. Her face was calm, smoothed out by the heavy sedatives they were pumping into her veins. But there was a tension in the corners of her mouth that no machine could read. "She's not a synchronization error," I said, my voice low. "She's a woman who has been shot, stabbed, chased through a sewer, and told her entire existence is a secret key for a genocide. If you don't think that causes trauma, then your people are even more broken than I thought." "Arbiter Valen is growing impatient," a new voice announced. I turned to see the Arbiter himself entering the room. He had traded his ceremonial robes for a sleek, silver tactical suit that looked like it was made of liquid mercury. He looked refreshed, cold, and entirely too satisfied. "The extraction of the Genesis sequence begins in 2 hours," Valen said, walking toward the holograms. "The High Council is demanding the key. The Obsidian Coil's failure has accelerated our timeline. We cannot risk another breach." "She won't survive the extraction," I said, stepping between the Arbiter and the bed. "I've seen the specs on your harvesting equipment. It's designed for high-density cellular removal. In her current state, with her sutures still knitting and her core rhythm unstable, the process will cause a total metabolic collapse. You'll have your sequence, sure, but Thyssen will be flatlined before you clear the first gigabyte." Valen looked at me, his expression one of bored amusement. "The commander understands the price of her duty, Dr. Vane. She is a soldier. She knows that the asset she carries is more important than the vessel that contains it." "Does she?" I asked, my heart hammering against my ribs. "Because for the last 3 days, she hasn't talked like a soldier. She talked like someone who wanted to see a plum-colored sky. She talked like someone who wanted to be ordinary." The Arbiter stepped closer, his presence radiating a cold, artificial heat. "Ordinary is a luxury for the weak, human. This woman is a legend. She is the spear of the hegemony. She belongs to the state, to history, and to the future of our race. You, with your rusted clinic and your mediocre coffee, have attempted to humanize a god. It was a sentimental mistake. He gestured to the guards. Remove the human. He has served his purpose as a biological buffer. The extraction will proceed as scheduled. One of the guards grabbed my arm, his grip like a crushing vice. I didn't fight him, not yet. I looked at Thistin, hoping for a sign, a flicker of those amber eyes. But she remained still, a beautiful statue caught in a web of silver light. "You're making a mistake, Valen," I shouted as they dragged me toward the exit. "If you treat her like a thing, she'll die like a thing, and you'll never get the resonance right. The core reacts to the host's will. You kill the host, you kill the key." The doors slid shut with a hiss of pressurized air, cutting off my voice. I was thrown into a small, windowless holding cell 3 levels down, the walls made of the same ivory ceramic. No bed, no chair, just a single glowing light in the ceiling that hummed at a frequency designed to keep the human mind from resting. I sat on the floor, my head in my hands. I had failed. I had saved her from the assassins only to hand her over to the bureaucrats. I had tried to prove that she was more than an asset, but in the face of an empire, ordinary was just another word for expendable. I thought about the boy in the filtration hub, the way he had run into the dark. I thought about Karis and the scavengers of Sector 9. They were the ones who understood. They knew what it was like to be discarded by the big wigs and the suit jockeys. They knew that the only thing that mattered at the end of the day was the person standing next to you. "Jackson?" The voice was faint, vibrating through the ventilation grate near the floor. It wasn't Thistin. It was a rasping, familiar cough. "Karis?" I whispered, crawling toward the grate. "Shh," the voice came back. "Don't talk loud. The tech wizards have ears everywhere. We're in the maintenance ducts. The Solari, they don't think humans can fit in here. They forgot we've been living in the vents of Ouroboros for 3 generations." "How did you get on the ship?" I asked, my mind reeling. "We hitched a ride in the waste compactors during the loading process," Karis said, followed by a wet wheeze. "The hegemony doesn't check the trash when they're in a hurry to leave. There are 10 of us, Doctor. We have arc welders and some leftover plasma charges from the scrapping yards." "You shouldn't be here, Karis. They'll zero you the moment they find you." "Maybe," Karis said, "but you treated my lungs when the Union told me to go die in a corner. And the lady," she looked at the kid. "She didn't let those black armor goons squeeze him. We saw it, Jackson. We saw her choose the kid over herself." A heavy silence followed. The weight of the theme I had been pushing, the idea that seeing the person was the most important act of all, was coming back to me from the most unexpected place. The scavengers weren't here for a bounty or a legend. They were here because someone had seen them as human. "What do you need, Doctor?" Karis asked. I looked at the ivory walls of my cell, then at the pulse pistol I had managed to hide in my medical kit before the guards took it. Or rather, the one I had left in the kit they hadn't bothered to check properly because they were too busy looking for weapons and not for medical supplies. They had taken the kit, but I knew where they kept the confiscated items, the security lockers near the medical wing. "I need a distraction," I said, my voice finally losing its tremor. "I need you to cause a synchronization error in their primary cooling manifolds. Can you do that?" "Doctor," Karis chuckled, a sound like grinding gravel, "I've been causing errors in hegemony hardware since before you were born. Just tell us when." 2 hours, I said. "Wait for my signal on the station-wide intercom." "And Karis?" "Yeah? Try not to get blown up. I've still got more lung expanders back at the clinic." "I'll hold you to that, Jackson. I'll hold you to that." The high-security medical wing of the Star Singer was a hive of activity when I was escorted back in, 2 hours later. The extraction equipment had been deployed, a massive circular array of obsidian-colored needles and glowing conduits that hung over Thistin's bed like a mechanical spider. The Arbiter stood at the control console, his face illuminated by the harsh blue light of the Genesis core's resonance frequency. "You are here to witness the glory of the hegemony, Dr. Valen said without turning around, "and to ensure that the vessel remains stable enough for the final transfer. Do not attempt any more heroics. The guards have orders to flatline you at the first sign of interference." I walked toward the bed, my footsteps heavy. Thiston was awake now, her eyes wide and clouded with terror. They had removed the sedatives to ensure the neural link was at maximum capacity. She was strapped down by bands of hardened light, her body trembling with the weight of the data being pulled from her blood. I leaned over her, ignoring the guards. I placed my hand on her forehead. She was burning up. Her core was reaching 43 degrees. 2 more degrees and the sequence would degrade. 2 more degrees and she would die. Jackson, she whispered, her voice a ghost of itself. I can't. It hurts. I know, Thiston, I said, my voice steady. I know, but I need you to listen to me. Remember the sky. Remember the plum-colored oceans. Remember being just a girl by the shore. Silence the human, Valen commanded. One of the honor guards stepped forward, raising his spear. I didn't look at him. I looked at the intercom panel on the wall, just 3 feet away. Karis, I whispered, too low for the microphones to catch. Now! A second later, the Star Singer shivered. A massive explosion rocked the lower decks, followed by the screech of failing turbines. The ivory walls flickered, the lights plunging into a deep, bloody red. The extraction array groaned, its obsidian needles sparking as the power flow became erratic. What is happening? Valen screamed, his fingers flying across the console. Report! Primary cooling manifolds are compromised, Arbiter, a voice shouted over the comms. Multiple explosions in the waste levels. We have a catastrophic synchronization failure in the reactor core. The guards were distracted, their training pushing them to check the perimeters. In that second of chaos, I moved. I didn't go for a weapon. I went for the medical override on Thiston's bed. I punched in the code I had memorized from the observation deck, a bypass meant for extreme surgical emergencies. The light band snapped open. Thiston gasped, her body arching as the pressure of the extraction was suddenly lifted. Jackson, go! She shouted, grabbing my arm. We go together, I said, pulling her off the bed. We didn't head for the door. We headed for the extraction array itself. I grabbed a heavy metal tray of surgical instruments and slammed it into the primary resonance chamber. The obsidian glass shattered, releasing a wave of raw, unrefined energy that knocked the guards to the floor. Valen roared, pulling a sleek pulse pistol from his belt. You would destroy the key? You would doom our future for a single, broken soldier? She's not a soldier, I yelled, shielding Thiston with my own body. She's Thiston, and if your future depends on killing her, then your future isn't worth having. I didn't wait for him to fire. I triggered the Cortex jammer I had managed to pull from my confiscated kit during the confusion. The device, overcharged by the ship's own failing power grid, emitted a shriek that felt like a hot needle being pushed into my brain. The Arbiter screamed, dropping his pistol as his neural implants short-circuited. The guards crumpled, their high-tech armor becoming their own prisons. Thiston stood up, her movement still shaky but her eyes clear. She looked at the Arbiter, then at the shattered remains of the Genesis core. She reached into the machinery and pulled out a small glowing crystal, the physical containment unit for the sequence. The key is mine, she said, her voice echoing with the authority of the general she used to be. And I choose to bury it. She slammed the crystal onto the floor, her boot crushing it into 1,000 sparkling shards. The light in the room died instantly, the resonance frequency vanishing into the hum of the ship's emergency generators. The Genesis core was gone. The secret was destroyed. The weapon had chosen to be a person. We made it to the maintenance ducts, guided by Karis' rasping voice over my encrypted comms. We waded through the narrow tubes, through the filth and the dark, until we reached a secondary escape shuttle in the lower bays. Karis and his scavengers were already there, their faces grimy, but their smiles wide. Ready for a ride, Doctor? Karis asked, coughing into his hand. Let's go home, I said. The Star Singer didn't explode. The scavengers were too good for that, but it was dead in the water, its primary systems fried by the synchronization failure. As our small shuttle drifted away into the void, I looked back at the massive carrier. It looked cold, empty, and strangely small against the backdrop of the stars. We didn't go back to Ouroboros. The clinic was gone, and the station was no longer safe. Instead, we headed for the edge of the sector toward a small, unnamed planet that Thiston had described in our quiet moments. A place where the sky was the color of a bruised plum. 6 months later, I sat on the porch of a small wooden cabin overlooking a deep emerald ocean. The air was thick with the scent of blooming salt flowers, and the water really did seem to sing a low, melodic resonance that matched the beat of my heart. I was holding a cup of coffee. It was still terrible. Some things, it seemed, were beyond even my medical skills, but it tasted like peace. Thiston came out of the cabin, wearing a simple linen dress that caught the purple light of the setting sun. Her ears were still pointed, her eyes were still filled with gold flecks, but the tension in her jaw was gone. She sat down next to me, leaning her head on my shoulder. "The sky is beautiful tonight, Jackson," she said. "Yeah," I replied, taking a sip of the sludge. "It really is." I looked at my hands. They were scarred, weathered by years of work and war, but they were steady. I wasn't the Spears medic anymore. I was just Jackson, and she was just Thiston. We were ordinary in the most extraordinary way possible. For years, I thought the only way to survive the galaxy was to build a wall of sarcasm and indifference. I thought that by treating everyone like a patient, a collection of wounds and heartbeats, I was protecting myself from the weight of their lives. I didn't want to see the legend because legends demand sacrifices. I didn't want to see the person because people demand love. I chose the middle ground, the clinic at the edge of the universe where nothing mattered but the next suture and the next cup of bad coffee. But sitting here, under this plum-colored sky, I realize how wrong I was. You can't truly heal a wound if you don't acknowledge the soul that feels the pain. To see someone as ordinary isn't an insult. It's the highest form of respect. It's the act of stripping away the titles, the expectations, and the big pictures to find the raw, fragile truth underneath. Thiston wasn't saved by my medical skills or my clever traps. She was saved because, for the first time in her life, someone looked at her and didn't see a weapon or a general or a secret key. They just saw her, and in doing so, I found myself again. I'm no longer a ghost haunting a rusted station. I'm a man who learned that the most important thing we can offer one another isn't a cure for the body, but a witness for the soul. I spent my life hiding behind a lab coat, terrified that if I saw the person behind the patient, the world would break me. I wonder, in your own life, how often do you look at the people around you, your friends, your family, even the strangers you pass on the street, and only see their utility? How often do you see the general, or the worker, or the asset, instead of the person who is just trying to find their own plum-colored sky? What would happen if, just for a moment, you chose to see the wound before the legend? Thisson squeezed my hand, her fingers interlocked with mine as the sun finally dipped below the horizon. I set my cup down on the wooden railing, the steam rising into the cool evening air. "Next time," she whispered, "I'm making the coffee." I laughed, the sound echoing across the singing ocean, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't have to look back.